bigger bridges, maybe even the Nieper bridges later in the war. And can I say that I suspect that even a single 1,500 kilo bomb would probably not be enough to destroy one of these massive bridges that the Soviet Union built across the Dnieper. But perhaps 3 or 4 bombs could, and it would certainly be cheaper to launch or to drop 3 or 4 precision-guided bombs against a bridge than to launch a couple of hypersonic missiles against a bridge, which is what I was speculating that such a bridge, which is what I was speculating that the Russians might do in earlier programs. So it seems to me that the Russians are rehearsing, they're preparing, they're gaining ground in these crucial battlefronts. They're continuing to make progress. Incidentally, there have been a number of reports that the Ukrainians were able to prevent the Russians closing their pincers around Bakhmut. And I think this is true. I mean, the Ukrainians deployed large numbers of troops to the Bakhmut battlefronts. They held on grimly in places like Ivanivska and Khromovo. The Russians have never, so far as I know, fully occupied areas of these roads, not until this point. And there have been some reports in the Western media that have counted this as a success. I don't think this is correct at all. I think that, on the contrary, Ukraine deploying forces, some of the forces that were apparently earmarked for the Zaporozhye counteroffensive, to hold places, little places like Khromovo and Ivanivska against the Russians, exposing those troops, those Ukrainian troops, to constant shelling, leading them to suffer heavy casualties and to continue to try and use these roads to send in supplies into Bakhmut at night. I've discussed in previous programs the harrowing pictures I've been seeing of the devastation that this is causing to Ukraine, that we see the roads now littered with burnt out Ukrainian vehicles. And as I said, I suspect lots of men have been dying trying to use these roads and the fields and the country lanes. Well, all of this, it seems to me, is completely misconceived. And I think it's what the Russians want to see happen. After all, it was General Surovikin who, way back in October, I think it was, gave an interview saying that his aim was to grind the Ukrainians down. And Prigozhin has confirmed that General Surovikin played a key role in planning the Battle of Bakhmut back in the summer, and that this was his plan to use Bakhmut to some extent as this meat grinder, horrible expression, but an accurate one, I suppose, in some ways, to grind down the Ukrainian forces in Bakhmut. And we can see that Ukraine, by trying to hold on to this small place, is playing straight into Surovikin's plan. They are committing some of their best trained troops, some of their best equipment, to trying to retain control of this small place. A strategically important place, admittedly, but they're committed to doing it. And the result is that more and more of their forces are being ground down there and are not going to be able to participate in this counteroffensive in Zaporozhye. And this is what I'm now going to come to, because we've now had a whole series of leaks to the Washington Post, to the New York Times, which make it absolutely clear that there are now growing doubts, or have been growing doubts all along, in the United States about the merits of this counteroffensive, We're told that Ukraine is only likely to make small, modest, incremental gains. It's unlikely to be able to sever the land bridge to Crimea. I'm not sure why people assume that it would be a decisive win if it cut it, but anyway, I guess it pass on. The United States expects that it's not going to be able to make more than modest gains, this offensive. It appears to accept that Ukraine is going to suffer extremely heavy losses carrying out this offensive. On that topic, by the way, I read a report earlier today that Ukraine is going to try to compensate for its lack of artillery, its lack of shells, by deploying more infantry. In other words, it's going to send infantry to attack Russian positions without artillery support, and is hoping that throwing waves of, well, I don't want to say waves, but anyway, throwing large numbers of presumably lightly equipped infantry without artillery support against Russian fortifications is somehow going to help Ukraine achieve a breakthrough. It might do in a few places, but Russian defenses in Zaporozhye region, in Kherson region, in Donbass are now layered. We've been told that there are, Jan Gagin, I think it was, who said that the Russians now have up to 4 layers of defenses. These are very heavily fortified defenses. One can see why the Pentagon now accepts, or at least some people in the Pentagon now acknowledge, that gains are going to be modest. And frankly, sending infantry against heavily fortified positions defended by artillery and drones, and with a defender having overwhelming superiority in the air, and now being able to launch heavy precision-guided bombs. Well, to my mind, this sounds absolutely terrible. It looks like the casualties Ukraine is going to suffer over the next few weeks, once the offensive gets going, is going to be horrendous. And we're getting all this information, interestingly enough, from this big document dump. And I think it is now universally acknowledged that people like Larry Johnson are absolutely right. As I said, I consider Larry Johnson's views about the authenticity of these documents to be authoritative, that these documents that have been produced since January are genuine, they are real, they are indeed classified internal US documents, apparently intended primarily for General Milley and for the US Joint Chiefs of Staff. They're giving us a picture, a very bleak picture, of the situation for Ukraine on the eve of this offensive. And by the way, these documents also make it very clear that if the defensive fails, or if it fails to achieve a breakthrough, then there is no possibility of Ukraine being re-equipped again to the level that it was last summer, or again this winter, in preparation, in anticipation of those offensives that took place in the autumn, and of this offensive which is coming this spring or summer. So that brings me back to the fundamental question. First of all, if